All right, well, it's 3 after. Why don't we get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome to Speaking of Oats. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever, good middle of the night, whatever time it is there where you are. I'm Diederichsen Hanks. I'm the Oat reader for Quaker/PepsiCo, and I'll be moderating today's session. Speaking of Oats is a partnership between the Oat newsletter and Oat Global. Oat Global is a public-private partnership that aims to coordinate and connect Oat researchers and extension professionals across the world with each other, and then also with people across the entire oat value chain. The Oat newsletter is a publication from the American Oat Workers that brings regular updates and news to people working on oats around the world. We got Charlene White, editor of the Oat newsletter, here with us today. If you're not already on the Oat newsletter and you'd like to be, visit oatnews.org. I will post that in the chat in just a second. Today's session is being recorded. It'll be made available later via YouTube. You can find previous sessions by searching Speaking of Oats on YouTube, or I will post a link to the channel where they're all hosted in the chat as well. One last note before I introduce today's speaker. If you have questions, please hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and submit them there using the Q&A box that pops up. Don't hit the chat button if you're asking a question to the speaker or to the whole group, because Zoom records the questions that are submitted in the Q&A box so we can follow up on them, or if there's any questions that we miss, follow up with somebody, but it erases everything in the chat window. So Q&A for Q&A, chat for chat. Yeah, thanks, Charlene. And so with that, let's get started. Today's speaker is Dr. Axel Diederichsen, a research scientist and curator at Plant Gene Resources Canada, the Canadian National Gene Bank for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. Axel plays critical roles in managing the seed gene bank and leading research related to germplasm collection, preservation, and application. He is also the Canadian national focal point to the FAO International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And today he'll be talking about the impact of global changes on oat conservation and exchange at Plant Gene Resources Canada. Axel, thanks for being here with us today, and take it away.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good morning, good evening, good day, whatever to the participants. Yes, I look forward to this. I'll share my screen. Does that look okay? Yes, I see you nodding. That's good. Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to speak about the impact of global changes on oat conservation and exchange at Plant Gene Resources of Canada. The focus will be on the changes that happened in the legal framework for operating a gene bank as ours. Since not all may be knowing where I am or where I work for Plant Gene Resources of Canada, Resources Phytogénétiques du Canada, which is the Canadian National Gene Bank for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. It was established in 1970 in Ottawa, 1998 moved to Saskatoon for the seed germplasm. We preserve all plant genetic resources of relevance for Canada. The seed germplasm, as I said, is located here in Saskatoon. 3 main deliverables of our gene bank, as of any other active gene bank, are viable germplasm to clients nationally and internationally, relevant information about the germplasm, and a contribution to the conservation of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. Last year, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. Since this is in the oat framework, I want to show at least one slide about oat, and a question always, and still is for me, should we say oat or should we say oats? It's a grammatical question. From the gene bank perspectives, I'm inclined to say oats because there are many, many oats, as you can see on this slide, and these are only a few. At Plant Gene Resources of Canada, we have a large collection of about 28,000 oat accessions samples. This includes 7,000 wild oats collected by Canadian scientists all over. So it includes all the wild species also. Actually, all wild species are represented in our gene bank. So an impressive diversity. This is only Avena sativa, the hexaploid cultivated oat, what I show here, some types. The structure will be that I want to give a short overview over the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. In short, refer to it as the treaty, and in particular, the multilateral system for access and benefit sharing, because this impacts mostly us, and in particular also the interaction with our clients. For some reason, moving the slides, I have to do it carefully with the mouse. The international treaty is a legal binding agreement, was negotiated by the FAO Commission on Genetic Resources from 1994 to 2001, entered into force in 2004. The objectives of the treaty are the conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, including the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of their use in harmony with the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, for sustainable agriculture and food security. The treaty has now about close to 150 member countries. Here you see a map. Missing are still big countries like China and Russia as signatory bodies. South Africa joined in the meantime. Canada has been a member since the beginning, the United States since 2016, Japan as 2013. These are two countries that have also big collections, relevant collections of plant genetic resources. Each country has a national focal point. For the US, it's Caitlin Scholl, it's a State Department, and for Canada, it is me. There are elements in this international treaty, several, but here are those that affect really the work and operation of gene banks. One element in Article 5 is about the conservation, exploration, collection, characterization, and documentation of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. Very much emphasized. 2 articles of the treaty refer explicitly to that. And the multilateral system of access and benefit sharing. Several articles of the treaty refer to that. And the treaty has developed a standard material transfer agreement, which is used by all gene banks that are under the control of the governments in the member countries of the treaty. And Plant Gene Resources of Canada is one of those. Then there's also a global information system for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. This is an outcome of Article 17 of the treaty. These are the articles that are most relevant for the operation of our gene bank and will affect also gene bank clients. The multilateral system, MLS, is for the access and benefit sharing. What is covered, which genetic resources? The treaty has an annex with a list of species that are covered. I think it's 62 crop groups or species that are listed that are covered. Globally, there are, from all gene banks that have holdings of those species, 1.3 million accessions that fall into this multilateral systems. Some countries, for example, Germany, but also Canada, voluntarily treat all their germplasm, not only the Annex 1 crops of the treaty, as if they were in the multilateral system. That means for any germplasm you request, you will need to agree to the terms of the multilateral, of the standard material transfer agreement. In 2018, the MLS contained material from the national gene banks of 54 countries, which is remarkable. The treaty has about 150 member countries. So many countries have not yet really gotten around to put their material in the multilateral system. And then there are the international agricultural research centers, and they are really very active in participating in this multilateral system. The benefit sharing is what is to be regulated. When accessing material, you have to agree to the standard material transfer agreement. And the key thing is that the treaty has established a benefit sharing fund to support projects in developing world countries that support the objectives of the treaty. And the benefit sharing fund was thought to receive contributions from the users of germplasm by requesting a small amount, but it's 1.1% of the value of the product that is marketed, with an obligatory payment if a product that contains material from the multilateral system is not available for others for research or breeding without restriction. This is the wording of the standard material transfer agreement, which means, for example, if something is patented, then it would be obligatory to make such a payment there, arising from the profits you have from marketing such a product that used gene bank material that comes from the multilateral system. The other article of the standard material transfer agreement calls for voluntary payments in the same amount if the material, the product you make, is available for research. For example, if it's covered by plant breeders' rights, because plant breeders' rights still have the plant breeders' privilege. Any plant breeder or researcher can use such material, so it's still accessible. So the treaty calls for voluntary payments in that instance. Projects are supported, and what happened since the introduction of the standard material transfer agreement in Canada, we implemented it in 2008, the flow of payments was much lower than expected. If you look at the flow of germplasm, this was the status in 2019. The numbers have changed, have increased a little bit. There is a lot of flow of germplasm globally. 5.4 million accessions were provided with the SMTA, but only 7% by contracting parties, which are countries, while the international agricultural research centers, they really ship a lot of germplasm around using the SMTA. Still, only 54 countries have entered the material in the multilateral system, while 181 countries have received germplasm out of the multilateral system. So there are unresolved issues, long discussions that happened and have not been resolved in the treaty. In 2019 was a meeting of the governing body where 6 years of negotiations to enhance possibly also the flow of funds to the benefit sharing fund were concluded without a result. They were halted. It's not continuing because there's a lot of questions. And here are some of the key points. Many countries, including Canada, propose that not only the 64 Annex 1 crops, but all plant genetic resources for food and agriculture should be covered by the multilateral system. Some countries are very resistant to that. Then there's a suggestion, instead of having the complicated 2 access modes that I described there, to have a subscription system only, which means if you are a user or potential user, you make a voluntary, very low contribution based on the volume of your income from plant products that are related to treaty crops, and then you would have free access without any other further obligations or payments. It's an interesting idea. but to restrict it to subscription only, that is a question that was very much discussed. And then, of course, also the rates of payment that this would imply. Another is that I talked about the voluntary payments. There are suggestions to make all payments obligatory, or even for material that is accessible under plant breeders' rights for others to use. And then there is another dimension that came in very strongly in the treaty, and it comes up in other fora, in particular in the CBD also, that benefit sharing not only for use of the material, which is a genetic resource, so the seed, you could see, or the germplasm as such, but also for the associated information, in particular the genetic sequence data that is extracted, because you can request material, generate such information, and someone else who never requested the material may use that information, may create a benefit. And some push very hard to make that also part of an benefit sharing regime. It's a very highly disputed topic, and you will hear the term DSI in many fora where this is discussed, and it has not been resolved in the treaty context. So the implications for us, all PGRC clients need to accept the standard material transfer agreement. Our clients are plant pathologists, plant breeders, genomic researchers, other researchers, citizen science scientists, everybody. Even if a school teacher wants to show yellow tomatoes and blue tomatoes to his students, will have to sign the standard material transfer agreement when requesting material from our gene bank. The legal framework, as I mentioned, came out of the treaty. Another aspect of the treaty from Article 17 is the global information system for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. This relates to some extent to the topic of DSI or GSD, that means digital sequence information or genetic sequence data. The treaty is mandates to establish such a global information system. The question is a little bit, what really is the role of this global information system? There's a suggestion, and there has a suggestion been made to introduce digital object identifiers, which is a unique identifier, and you can use it for any object. Many of you will know it for publications. They have DOIs. There's a suggestion to have it for gene bank accessions. And there are even suggestions to assign a new DOI after each exchange of germplasm, which will, and the intention behind this is to establish a global, complete trace and tracking system for all exchange of germplasm with whoever accessing the multilateral system, which would be a big enterprise. And these discussions are also ongoing and relate a lot also to the discussions on the exchange of information as such. So this relates to a big paradigm shift that happened. Information associated with a genetic resource is as or more important than the material and requires a benefit sharing regime. I put 3 question marks here. Some have already 20 years ago talked about the in silico gene bank, so that maybe the seed and whatever the clonal material is not as relevant. We can do it all with saving sequence data in a computer somewhere there. While this discussion or this paradigm shift was mentioned very clearly in 2013, there was the 5th session of the governing body, and the secretary of the plant treaty, Shakil Bhatti, gave a presentation at the beginning of this big session where all member countries were present and used the term dematerialization. And he stated, breeding is no longer so focused on plant genetic resources as raw materials. So it's more the sequence data. That is what he said. And the question is, should the treaty also regulate that? New terms emerged: digital sequence information, DSI, genetic sequence data, GSD, or nucleotide sequence data, NSD. In many documents, footnotes appear now. For example, the one I put here, that just stating the terminology is not yet clear. So a big discussions, very complex discussions ongoing in several international fora, which may impact us as gene banks, could impact us drastically, because if you have a broad definition of DSI or information associated, even the species identification could become an information that you becomes part of being regulated when you exchange it. So it really needs attention. But it's obvious information is essential for managing and using genetic resources. That's absolutely not new. We have management data, seed amounts, viability data. Then we have the passport data, species name, intraspecific names, geographic origin, collection site, donor, cultivar name, pedigree information, and more. We have phenotypic characterization data, which is morphological agronomic characters. We have phenotypic evaluation data, agronomic, more complex or quantitative traits, disease resistances. And then we have genotypic characterization or evaluation data, which is molecular data, which is more the genetic sequence data that now sparked all these big discussions. Gene bank clients need information associated with the material for using it. Many databases exist and emerge, continue to emerge. These are only a few I show here. I call it a database jungle. The key databases, of course, for an operating gene bank are usually at the institute level, where institutes that hold collections, for example, our fruit collection in Harrow, or the potato collection in Fredericton in Canada, or an INVA Institute in France, they will have databases about their collections. Sometimes they feed into national gene bank information systems, for example, our Green Global Canada PGRC database. So there's a link, a relation between those. Our database then feeds into other systems. For example, the FAO has a views database. The Global Crop Diversity Trust has a Genesis database using this data, and maybe the Global Information System database I talked about coming out of the treaty will feed on the same thing. So many connections. It's actually a quite confusing picture, and this is only very little. So we have databases on the institute level, the national level, supranational level, and then the global level. Key is, so for operating a gene bank, you must keep it here in good shape, that you, for handling a collection, have a solid database there. So the implications of the treaty is we have an utilitarian aspect. It's a rational and efficient global system to ensure conservation and access to, as well as development of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, for food security. There's a political aspect to ensure due acknowledgements of contributions, including non-monetary contributions, to reach the objectives of the treaty. There's also a moral aspect. It's about enhanced trust building among countries as a basis to ensure exchange of materials, genetic resources, and information to enhance agricultural sustainability and food security globally. I like to show this slide based on what I showed. If you have here the time axis, over time it got much more easier to access germplasm, because communication and mailing services and so on improved very much, knowledge who has what where. But when the international agreements came in, it may be called an access chill, is sometimes used as a term. So it got much more difficult because of the regulation. And we see a trend that's probably more difficult internationally also to access germplasm. Information was pretty hard in the old days, but with the computerization, a big jump in accessing information globally, and it probably is much steeper. This is only a graph not based on any quantifications there, but, and I put a question mark here, what may happen is that this also gets now, that we will see an access chill regarding information there. So the question is whether we can bend these curves. With that, I'm at the end of my presentation. I thank you very much, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Axel. I'll start with one. I don't see any popped in the Q&A window yet. I was wondering about the Annex 1 expansion for the MLS. Is that coming from, are there specific crops or sectors that are driving that? I mean, I was looking at the Annex 1 species and it's like, okay, there are certainly people in the, there's certainly some major fruit and veg crops that are missing. Is that coming from kind of a concerted effort? And then a follow-up question is, are there groups or entities that oppose expanding Annex 1 to, okay, this, that, or the other system, and what's the motivation there?
Yes, to the first question, so that was, if I understood correctly, which species or groups we would like to have also covered. There are some very important groups or species of cultivated plants that are not covered, for example, soya bean, globally very important. That was because when the treaty and the treaty was set up with the Annex 1 list, China intervened and didn't want soya on the list there. There are others, tomatoes are not there, for example, also an important one. And there are quite some vegetable species which are also important. So the question is, what happens when we exchange those? Either nothing, or countries can use the SMTA of the treaty. That's what we have decided in Canada and other countries. It makes our operation easier. Or you can make up any agreement you like, you want to make with your client there. And many countries then would fall to the system that came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has a Nagoya Protocol, which came into force, I think, 2014. So you can revert to that. And this is bilateral, it's not a multilateral. So the terms, you have to agree on the terms in each case. So that's very complicated to handle and manage there. So therefore, from the practical side, but also for having in mind that food security is behind this. This is about crop plants, cultivated plants, and crop wild relatives. So genetic resources important for ensuring that breeding can adapt to future challenges and changes to enhance food security. It would be an advantage to really integrate more into this global system to have legal clarity for users of this material. This now to the second part of the question, it is several countries. The proposal was articulated very loudly from Switzerland to expand to all plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, the Annex 1, or what is covered by the treaty. And this is actually also the language of the treaty. In Article 3, it says this treaty covers all plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. So it would be consistent with that. But there are countries that are reluctant because they prefer to have the option to make bilateral agreements where they maybe see more benefits or flow of benefits to them directly by having the option to case by case developing these agreements or terms and possible benefit sharing implications.
see we've got a question from Jennifer Mitchell-Fetch here. Is it possible to obtain new and unique germplasm from the centers of origins for oats to utilize in breeding and genetic disease resistance? Also, great overview, Axel. Missed that.
Of course, what it is possible for sure for those we have in our gene bank here in Canada, or other national gene banks that have decided to place the material in the multilateral system there. As you know, the crop relatives of oats occur in the Mediterranean area. There are European countries, but then there are also North African countries and the Near East countries. And if you would go there now, it may be more complicated than it was in the past. If you look in the history of the Canadian Gene Bank, it's very interesting. We had taxonomists from Ottawa. Bernhard Baum was one of them, and other scientists from plant breeders from Winnipeg, Martens and Zielinski, cytologists, who participated in collection missions in the 1970s up to the 1980s, traveling to countries in the Near East when it was still not regulated as much, brought these collections together and shared, of course, with the hosting countries, but entered that into our gene bank collection. It would be very, very complicated to do collections like that today. Although the Global Crop Diversity Trust has had and will continue to have an initiative focusing on crop wild relatives, they have also collected, for example, wild oats, and have deposited 2 years ago 200 samples that they collected in these countries, was going through all the formalities, deposited them also in our Canadian Gene Bank, and they will be accessible under the terms of the Standard Material Transfer Agreement. So for oats, yes, and for this material, it continues to function, but it's much more complicated also regarding the regulatory issues than it used to be in the past. And it's probably a good idea to make sure that this collection here oat collection in particular, is preserved, because none of the international agricultural research centers has a mandate or focus on oat genetic resources. So the Canadian collection is a little bit unique in this regard for oats.
Claudia had asked, can you give examples of in silico gene banks? This is the first time I've heard this term.
Yes. Well, it's a little bit, it's a term that has been used perhaps a little bit casually already 20 years ago. But in the meantime, we have big databases for genetic sequence data, international databases in the United States, in Europe, in Japan. There are 3 big ones, and they go in this direction. They don't refer to themselves as in silico gene banks, right? But even the term gene bank was established in the 1970s or late 1960s even, the term gene bank. It was actually at that time clear that this is not, it's about genotypes. That was the entity preserved in gene banks. Genotypes contain gene. In the meantime, the name gene bank has got a little bit a different meaning there, because there are now these gene banks which are not about material. They are about sequence data there. The term in silico gene bank is a little bit a casual term. It's not a formal term that is used, but just a little bit a catchy phrase to maybe show at the potential future. And I can share with you that that people have spoken to me and have said, Axel, maybe not so far from now, we don't need your big gene bank collections anymore, the physical collections, because maybe we can do it with retrieving everything just out of the sequence data we have somewhere, re-synthesizing, integrating, shifting, sharing, and so on, gluing together, and then click on the 3D print button on your computer and the seed will fall out and you can plant it. I think we are not there yet and we won't be there for a while.
We've got a longer question here from Alexei Zavarsin. Dear Axel, as always, it is a pleasure to listen to your talks. However, again, my question is what to do, how to regulate the end of the chain that starts with the treaty and MLS. At the end, we have privatization of the breeding results, commercial varieties, nowadays largely by just a few global breeding companies. Don't you see the risk that the treaty allows or imposes global sharing of material, but does not secure equal access to the breeding results for food security?
Yes, a very good question and points at the key issue. The key issue is there's mistrust. That's the key issue. My maybe over-optimistic hope is that all, including these big companies, realize what is at stake if we cannot exchange material anymore there, so that we come to a solution. And I think that realization of the importance for food security, for our future as humans, is there on all sides. So yes, the concern is well seen and understood, and it has been acknowledged by the global community, by all attending also the governing body meeting of the treaty, that the flow into the benefit sharing fund has not really met expectations that were there and that were articulated and by all. So yes, that is there. So I think that is a good, was a good starting base, but unfortunately the mistrust then was too big to come to an agreement in 2019.
I have, I don't see any in the Q&A. I had one more question about, kind of about the numbers that you had said about the number of accessions, the enormous number of accessions being moved around the world globally. So you said that it was 5.4 million accessions, a vast majority involving one of the CG centers.
Yes.
Is there information readily available, or is anyone asked the question of, I guess in essence, is it really a core set that everybody wants to get their hands on? In essence, are we seeing certain accessions or certain pools that everybody really wants to be drawing on because they've been proven in breeding programs or otherwise? Or is it that everyone is accessing everything and requesting everything?
A very interesting question, yeah. I have not looked in detail into that, and it may be tricky or difficult to access it because what exactly is requested is not always accessible, and we have even said that it may not be, it should maybe not be made obligatory that, for example, we as a Canadian Gene Bank tell to each and everybody who requested what, because some people that work in breeding on something, they like to work, they have maybe a new idea, and if we would publish right away, then anybody else or a possible competitor could right away see and make conclusions on that. A result could then be that people request much more than they need, only to hide their real interest, which would be a disaster, right? So we have said that. So it's not so easy. In some cases, though, for the International Agricultural Research Centers, the information is available. For sure, it is the big crops, the big cereals, which is the majority of requests, but also and maybe some crop relatives that are important for that. But we have requested that the FAO Commission on Genetic Resources undertakes a study to show a little bit more, or an updated produces an updated report of the flow of germplasm from and to gene banks internationally also. And that may also go to the species level, because the data is reported to them. So this study will be part of the next, it will be a thematic study that is added to the next Status of the World report of plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, which I think will be finalized 2022, maybe 2023. So that would help to give some more insights into these very, very interesting, this very interesting aspect there.
I have a question. I'm wondering, so oats, I mean, we don't just have the cultivated oats, there are the crop wild relatives. So there are actually a couple of things here. First off, is there anything in the Convention for Biological Diversity and so on that also covers wild oats and that sort of thing? And also I'm wondering about this country of origin thing. So for example, you know, oats aren't from North America. They've all been brought here from other places. And do you get into trouble with where these oats have been received from?
Yeah, now it gets complicated. Of course, the material, also a lot of material, and most of the, well, all of the material. I've collected a few wild oats in Canada, and we have lots of them, I can tell you here in Saskatchewan, only of one species. But yes, they come from other countries, and some of those countries would not allow access today easily, right? But these international agreements cannot be applied retroactively. Some would like to do that, which would make things very complicated for a collection like ours, right? But that is actually, as far as I understand, also to common practice with international laws, not possible there. So legally, it's not there. Morally, you can still question that, right? But that relates to the trust building question, I think. So that was the first part of the question. The second part of the question, could you repeat that? You had another aspect.
Well, it was what other sort of international bodies govern the use of oats and so on too.
Exactly, yeah, sorry. Yes, that's also a very, that gets complicated. As I said, first of all, there's the Annex 1 list of the treaty, oat is included. So if germplasm is in the control of a contracting party to the treaty, which is a country, and if it's in control, that means it's in the National Gene Bank, then they should follow the treaty and make it accessible under the using the standard material transfer agreement. If it's in the country but not in the control of the country or the contracting party, for example, a university collection or a private collection or whatever, then it's between those holders and the clients to make out something there. Then we have those that are in the wild, right, that are not collected, and there it gets complicated. If you go by the letter of the treaty for now, they also, if it's on public land in a country, and this public land is in the national domain, it should be accessible. But there maybe we were ready to make a concession and say, okay, we restrict this accessibility only if it's in the National Gene Bank. We won't include those. That was a concession, a major concession, because the letter of the treaty is different there. But as you see, it gets very complicated there. And then if it's not covered by the treaty, other rules may be applied. They can revert to the Nagoya Protocol, or they can make material transfer agreements. I think then the holders are entitled to make agreements as they want to do it. Very complicated, yes. So the conclusion is, if you request germplasm these days, make sure which strings are attached, just in case.
And so what's the best way to do that?
Well, my maybe naive suggestion would be support that the treaty becomes or stays functional, and help that this trust building happens, so that we come, because it's a relatively easy, I would say, straightforward system with the standard material transfer agreement. All participating countries are on the same term there, but it will require this element of saying yes, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of plant genetic resources is something we take seriously.
Any final questions for Axel here? Well, on that note, we'll let everyone out a little early. Thank you for a really wonderful talk here. That was extremely fascinating. And like I said, that'll be posted up on the YouTube channel at a later point here. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.